Hello, everyone. We are on the air. This is Petrarch again, Aleksandr Rosenthal. I am here, although he is somewhat incorporeal today, with my good friend Miles Smith. Miles, do you want to say hello?
Hello, everyone. Great to have you with us today. We're going to be talking about something today that's quite topical about the underpinning principles and the direction of society, especially in modernity. But before we launch into it, Alex, did you want to let everyone know what the latest offerings are on the front in terms of our courses and the curriculum at Petrarch?
Yeah, so I mean, basically what Petrarch does is offer courses on the broad theme of the classics. So we have a course on the foundations of rhetoric. We've had a course in moral philosophy, on classical philosophy and the virtues, focusing on the virtue tradition in Plato and Aristotle. And we had a course on Nietzsche and Socrates. I mean, there's a lot of other courses that are currently under discussion, including courses in drama and perhaps one on Stoicism and all sorts of stuff. So I encourage you to reach out to me. I've posted my email on this video, and if you're interested in learning more about the Petrarch Institute and what we do, just send me a line, as it were, or whatever we call emails these days. So I thought that this would be an interesting topic. It was actually suggested to be by Miles. Miles, did you want to tell us a little bit about what you were thinking in terms of the famous address by Solzhenityen at Harvard? I think it was in 1978, and his discussion of the Renaissance, and what were you thinking about in terms of this topic?
Yeah, that's right. Well, what triggered it was there's been a lot of revisited interest in Solzhenitsyn, partly because I think his critique of Western civilization is gaining traction among people interested in ideas, both young and old now, but also just in terms of anniversaries that come around. Because there's a 50th anniversary edition of the Gulag Archipelago coming out, and because there was renewed scrutiny of his address to the students of Harvard, in which he lays a pretty direct finger of accusation at the Renaissance, it seemed like something that we at the Petrarch Institute should take up. It's a very entertaining speech as well as a serious one, because he talks about the insipidity of television and intolerable music and things like that. And he asked, why are we all raising glasses as we glide towards hell? But despite the fact that it's in some ways, full of Russian wit and jovial teasing, it's a pretty substantial question. And we've looked at critiques of the Renaissance and the humanist tradition in some of our podcasts in the past, some of our YouTube videos, but we haven't really tackled traditionalist critiques of the Renaissance. And when I mentioned it, Alex came up with a number of different thinkers and threads on which that critique has been leveled. And as you see young people turning towards tradition, perhaps in a form of repudiation of the modern world they've inherited, it seemed like a timely conversation. So Alex, how did you want to break out that exploration?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think it's a very interesting topic that Miles had suggested, because we have discussed progressivist critiques of the classics, like John Dewey, right, who argued that the reactionary movement, what he called the reactionary movement, meaning the movement back toward the classics and the great books, he said that it ignores what he called an advance so marvelous that the progress in knowledge is almost uncounted previous millenniums is almost nothing in comparison, right? So Dewey was arguing, why are you going back to this primitive classicist stuff, right, that really got going in the Renaissance? But the Renaissance is also hit by the other side. So I think it's kind of interesting, and maybe you might kind of expect it as this period, which is kind of in the pincers, right? It's kind of in between the medieval world and the modern world. So it's attacked both, as it were, by modernists and by traditionalists. So I thought it would be an interesting thing to go forward. So I think first we would look at the actual critics. What are the critiques? And I think you'll find that a lot of them are based on this idea of anthropocentrism, right? The idea that the Renaissance made man the center, and that this has been the theme of Western modernity, and that this has led to secularism. Almost all of the critics are coming at it from the standpoint of religion, right? That what is bad about modernity is that, in contrast to the perennial traditions of mankind in every human civilization, right? We have a Christian civilization of Europe, an Islamic civilization of the Middle East, the Jewish civilization of ancient Israel, the Hindu civilization of India, and so forth, right? All the perennial traditions have been religiously based. The modern world introduced this idea of secularism. So shall we start with a few excerpts from Solzhenitsyn, and then we'll look at some other thinkers. So Solzhenitsyn, in this speech, he says, I refer to the prevailing Western view of the world, which was first born during the Renaissance and found its political expression from the period of the Enlightenment. It became the basis for government and social science and could be defined as rationalistic humanism or humanistic autonomy, the proclaimed and enforced autonomy of man from any higher force above him. It could also be called anthropocentricity, which makes man as the center of everything that exists, right? So the argument is the Renaissance creates a man-centered universe, replacing the God-centered universe of the Middle Ages. Now, another theme here is, well, Berdyaev, among others, Spengler, among others, talks about the character of modern civilization as Faustian, right? That is, if the Middle Ages prioritize the life of the spirit and somewhat deprioritize material advancement and the material focus, modern world has reversed this, right? It has become despiritualized and focused on economics, technology, things that advance the human material condition, right? So he writes, the turn introduced by the Renaissance evidently was inevitable historically. The Middle Ages had come to a natural end by exhaustion, becoming an intolerable despotic repression of man's physical nature in favor of the spiritual one. Then, however, we turned our backs upon the spirit and embraced all that is material with excessive and unwarranted zeal. The new way of thinking, which had been imposed by us, which had imposed on us its guidance, did not admit the existence of intrinsic evil in man, nor did it see any higher task than the attainment of happiness on earth. It based modern Western civilization on the dangerous trend to worship man and his material needs. Everything beyond physical well-being and accumulation of material goods, all other human requirements and characteristics of a subtler and higher nature were left outside the area of attention of state and social systems, right? So modern man is, you could think, for example, of the consumer society, right? Where people are focused on the accumulation of material goods, material abundance, material uplift, and not as concerned with the world of religion, of the spirit, of the advancement of the souls, right, as they would be in traditional civilizations. You could see this even in architecture, right? Right. I mean, Christopher Dawson made the point that in the material impoverished Middle Ages, the monuments are these brilliant cathedrals to God, right? Whereas in the modern world, they're monuments to chewing gum or other sorts of material goods, right? The modern skyscrapers are monuments of today. Traditionalists argue are kind of materially oriented. Now, it's possible, now we find in Nicholas Berdyaev very similar ideas. We know Solzhenitsyn had read Berdyaev. He has quotes, I believe, in the Gulag Archipelago. And what Berdyaev argues is basically that so he says, on the one hand, that all of modern civilization can be understood from the themes that were introduced by the Renaissance. So he said, the inner guiding spirit of modern history, which had inspired the Renaissance of the 15th and 16th centuries and continued to do so throughout modern history, is only now beginning to abandon its sway. This was the humanist spirit, which lies at the foundation of all modern conceptions. right? Now, what does he think happens, Berdyaev? This is important. What happened? That actually, by making man the center, man ultimately became debased, right? Because man was considered from a materialistic worldview instead of what he was in the old Christian worldview, which is the crown of the visible creation, created in God's image, right? Given dominion, redeemed by Christ, destined for eternal life. Instead, man becomes just this speck, the product of random material forces, right? The secular worldview. He says humanism not only affirmed man's self-confidence and exalted him, but it also debased him by ceasing to regard him as a being of a higher and divine origin. It affirmed exclusively his terrestrial birthplace and origin at the expense of the celestial. And so what Berdyaev thinks is that the contemporary world, let's say the 19th and 20th centuries and beyond, are basically the end of the Renaissance, right? What began with this idea of human dignity in the Renaissance has now become anti-humanisms, right? And he might be thinking of things like the totalitarianisms, right, which emphasize economic forces or race, right, in the case of Nazism, right, and these material things which subjugate man and are kind of viewed as in some way some way more important than humans, these material forces, right? So humanism to Berdyaev becomes anti-humanism. And that the poison seeds were laid at the Renaissance itself, although Berdyaev has nuances as well in his view of the Renaissance. Now, another approach to the Renaissance, which I think you'll find is quite similar, Seyyed Hossein Nasr, right? He wants to discuss, well, what is modernity, right? And so he's coming now from an Islamic perspective, right? And so what he says is that traditionalists like myself use the term modernism not in a vague way as characterizing just things that happen to be around today, but as a particular way of looking at the world, a worldview that began in the Renaissance in the West with such components as Renaissance humanism, rationalism, etc. Modernism rejects the primacy of absolute and ultimate truth transcending the human order and descending upon the human realm from the divine order. It places man at the center of the stage as the absolute. So we have the identical idea, right? Except Nasr is going to emphasize it's a rejection of all of the perennial traditions, right? Which the West has spawned this new kind of culture, which is anthropocentric, places man at the center, denies any being above or beyond man, right? And his needs, right? And is materially focused. And he's perhaps implicitly responding to Bernard Lewis, right, who asked the question, what went wrong in the Islamic world? Nasr turns the tables, right? He says, some have tried to fault Islamic civilization for not following the same trajectory of development that took place in Europe and have asked what went wrong in reference to the Islamic world. If we look at world history, however, the question should not be what went wrong in the Islamic world, but what went wrong in Europe. The very question, what went wrong, implies a norm or a right against which something is judged to be wrong. Now, the global norm was once traditional civilizations based on religious and spiritual principles and rooted in a theocentric, that is God-centered, or anthropocosmic worldview, as we see in Japanese, Chinese, Hindu, Islamic, Byzantine, and medieval European civilizations. It was post-medieval Europe that deviated from the norm by substituting an anthropocentric worldview for a theocentric one, making human beings the measure of all things, or, to use a religious language, replacing the kingdom of God with the kingdom of man, right? So we have in all of them this idea that the Renaissance is to be blamed for being at the inception of anthropocentrism, right? Making man the center rather than God, or at least some spiritual principle of ultimate reality. And these kinds of cultures, which did base themselves on spiritual principles, were the basis of all civilizations before the modern West, right? Which is now, he would argue, in a sense, making war on all the other civilizations in a cultural sense, right? Sort of trying to replace the old traditions. So that would be my summary of the critiques. Miles, did you have any thoughts, comments, or questions before I move on to an examination of the critiques?
No, not really. I think it's a good synopsis, really. And just in quick summary, the questions it seems to raise are: is it accurate that the Renaissance is some kind of pivotal turning point? Related to that, is it accurate that the Renaissance is somehow the beginning of certain modern diseases? In other words, does it contain the seeds of an eventual negative dynamic within itself? And beyond that, is it accurate that it's some kind of betrayal of tradition? Is it some kind of a materialization of the world, of man and his place in it? And does it simply exalt man, or does it offer a kind of ennobling vision which can be cultivated and exploited, for lack of a better word? So I mean, I hear sort of those themes, and I guess part of the question is how many of those charges are accurate and in what way?
Yes, and we'll examine the Renaissance in a moment. I think that it might be good just to look at some of the things which I think might be representative of the kind of world that Berdiaev, Solzhenitsyn, and some of the things in modernity that Berdiaev, Solzhenitsyn, and Nasr would all be critiquing, right? So the emergence of a secular humanism clearly existed by the time we get to the Enlightenment in the 18th century, at least the radical Enlightenment. So here's a quote from Baron de Holbach, right? He says, the human mind, confused with its theological opinions, forgot itself, doubted its own powers, mistrusted experience, feared truth, disdained its reason, and abandoned her direction blindly to follow authority. Man was a mere machine in the hands of his tyrants and priests, right? So we clearly have the emergence by the 18th century of this modern worldview that they're talking about, that in order to liberate man, we must free ourselves from the chains of religion and tradition, right? As Neil Ormerod said, right, the dead hand, he's describing the Enlightenment, he says, the dead hand of tradition is replaced by the march of progress driven by science and technology, right? And I would say, if you look, and whatever you think about it, whether you think these things are good or bad, we could just look at some quotes from early modern thinkers that we might think of in terms of the kind of attitude that they're describing toward the past, right? So Francis Bacon says, and it begins really with this notion of the sciences, right? The notion that we have to sort of begin again and leave the past behind. So Francis Bacon writes, again, men have been kept back as by a kind of enchantment from progress in the sciences by reverence for antiquity. And then René Descartes, in his work on the passions, he wrote, what the ancients have taught is so scanty and for the most part so lacking in credibility that I may not hope for any kind of approach toward truth except by rejecting all the paths which they have followed, right? So you have this idea of starting over, right, that starts to emerge around the 17th century, certainly. And from the sciences, it moves on to institutions, right? I mean, you could think of the French revolutions, who made the year 1792 year one, right? Abolishing the past and just sort of starting over, right? And the idea of looking forward to the future based on modern principles rather than to the past. Now the question is, does the Renaissance partake of this modernist or progressivist leaning in terms of how it behaved, how it looked upon the past? And I think the obvious answer is just the opposite, right? So Erasmus writes in his work on education, De Ratione Studia, he says, sed imprimis ad fontes ipsos properandum ides Graecos et Antiquos, right? So the idea is, go at once to the sources, that is the Greeks and the ancients, right? So the idea is precisely veneration of antiquity returning to the deep sources of the European tradition in the Greeks and Romans, many of which had been lost, right? The knowledge of Greek had been lost almost entirely after the fall of the Roman Empire. Plato and other thinkers had been lost. So the idea was, how do we recover antiquity, right? And people like the Medicis and the Florentine Academy, right, were spending enormous efforts and sums, right, looking for ancient manuscripts. So the Renaissance was fundamentally about tradition, about recovering antiquity and venerating antiquity. Now, what is true, and E. Christian Kopp would make this point, is tradition proved enormously fertile in terms of it lived again in the societies of the Renaissance and was a font of new creative achievement, as often happens, right? Tradition proved to be a font. Now, what I think we would have to concede, but this goes much deeper than the Renaissance, is that the classical world itself was, I wouldn't say anthropocentric, but I would say humanist, right? In that its form of education was centrally concerned with human culture and human improvement, right? So you could think of Aulus Gellius, right, after he talks about education and training in the human arts, he says, those who earnestly desire and seek after these are most highly humanized, for the pursuit of that kind of knowledge and the training given by it have been granted to man alone of all the animals, and for that reason it is termed humanitas, or humanity, right? So Dawson makes the point that the classical system of education, which has lived throughout the whole history of Western civilization and been transmitted, right, from the Greeks to the Romans to the Middle Ages to the modern world, to the Renaissance, through the Renaissance to the modern world, is a somewhat unique tradition of education, right? I mean, if we think about many other forms of education that have existed, right? You could think of the Jewish education of Talmudic study, or the Hindu education, which was the training for the Brahmins, or the madrasas with their study of Quranic commentaries. Much of formal education, most civilizations has been theologically or religiously focused. Here we have a system of education which is humanly focused, right? Which makes man and the development of man's intellectual, moral, and aesthetic qualities as the focus. So that is one point. The next question to ask is, was the Renaissance in any sense anti-religious or specifically anti-Christian in any sense? And there again, I think we have to say an emphatic no. So if we look at Marsilius Ficino, who was the translator of Plato and a central figure in the Florentine Renaissance, right? He inspired a lot of the artists, the arts and letters, right, with his Florentine Academy. He discusses what is it which distinguishes the human species from the animals, right? And so he asks, so what is left there after going through the various possibilities? He says, so what is left there which is entirely and solely man's? The contemplation of the divine. For the beasts display no sign of religion. The lifting of our mind to God, the King of heaven, is as properly ours as the raising upright of our body toward heaven. Worshipping the divine is as natural to men, almost as neighing to horses or barking to dogs, right? So one of the most pivotal intellectuals and translators of the Renaissance, right, who's right at the heart of the movement, is saying that what distinguishes man from the animals is not even reason, as would be said by the Greeks, but religion, right? So, and his interest in Plato was looking for notions like the divine and particularly the immortality of the soul, right? Which he thought were very consonant with Christianity. Now, the next theme that I wanted to discuss was continuity between the medieval and Renaissance worlds, and to show how many of the themes that were developed in the Renaissance actually find root in the Middle Ages. But I didn't know if Miles, before I go on, were there any thoughts or comments you had there before I go on to that?
No, I'm actually interested to hear what you have to say next.
Okay. So I mean, first of all, the translation process had begun in the Middle Ages with Aristotle, right? In the 12th century, you had all the translations from Greek to Latin of Aristotle. And you have the new theology at the time of Thomas Aquinas, right? And so I guess what the main point I would make here is these critics of the Renaissance see Western society as having gone from a theocentric society to a anthropocentric society, right? From a God-centered to a man-centered. But what I'd like to suggest is an idea that you find in, there was an article I read by Thornhill, and I think it's discussed in Dawson as well, right? This idea of Christocentrism, right? So the unique Christian doctrine of the incarnation is that God is both divine, that Christ is both divine and man, right? And I think what you find in the Middle Ages is that this idea of the divine and the human is going to play roles in all aspects of medieval culture, right? So we see this notion of the unity between faith and reason, right? Between the church and the state, between grace and nature, right? Always the divine principle and the human principle, which I think is related to this Catholic doctrine of the incarnation. So, for example, Aquinas asked the question whether we need to be, reliant on supernatural actions of God, right, for our understanding, right? Whether we need to be illumined, right? And so what he says is that wherefore also the light of faith, which is gratuitously infused into our mind, does not destroy the natural light of cognition, which is in us by nature. For although the natural light of the human mind is insufficient to reveal those truths revealed by faith, yet it is impossible that those things which God has manifested to us by faith should be contrary to those which are evident to us by natural knowledge, right? So we find in Aquinas this idea that the natural human powers have a great realm of competence, right? And he says that gifts of grace are added to those of nature in such a way that they do not destroy the latter, but rather perfect them. So that the divine principle and the human principle are not contrary principles, but are harmonious principles, right? At least can be brought into harmony. And so this blessing of the human realm at the level, it is true, of theology, right? Theology and philosophy in the medieval world, I think lays a lot of the foundation for the blessing of human culture, which you find in the Renaissance. And you could think of the great flowering of arts, right, which both celebrated the human form. Think of the Sistine Chapel, right, or the David of Michelangelo, the statues of Donatello, Ghiberti on the Florentine baptistry, the Last Supper of Da Vinci, all religious art, right? But all also glorifying man in terms of human dignity, right? Think of Michelangelo, what he said. He said, every good painting is noble and devout of itself, for it is nothing more than a copy of the perfections of God and reminiscence of his own painting, right? So there's a glorification of human creative powers, but of man as being in God's image, right? And using those powers to give glory to his creator, right? So, I mean, just the fact that the Vatican is one of the most famous, the St. Peter's Basilica, one of the most famous products of the Renaissance, should give you some sense that there was a keen religious focus to this work. Another point I think that's important is not peripheral here, is the role of humanism in terms of the recovery of Greek and Latin and giving impetus to scriptural studies. Because remember, in the Middle Ages, people were reading the Bible in Latin translation. But with humanism, you have people like Cardinal Jimenez in Spain, who produces a polyglot Bible. And then you have Erasmus, who uses his knowledge of Greek to study the New Testament. as well as you had with a collegium in Leuven, right? You had the study of Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, right? So this promotion of philology had a great influence on the revival of biblical exegesis, which also played into the Reformation, right, with their concerns for scripture. And also, if you look at most of the Renaissance educators, like, for example, Leonardo Bruni, you see that they emphasize not only the study of the pagan classics of Plato and Aristotle and Cicero and Quintilian and so forth, but also of the church fathers, right? So they did not read these things in conflict the way we might see later on. So I guess that more or less, and I should say that humanism that ended up getting incorporated into the religious educations, right? So the Jesuit system of education incorporated the humanist curriculum. Many of the reformers, including John Calvin, right? He was a scholar of Seneca, right? Christopher Dawson even makes the point that when religious unity broke down in Western Europe after the Protestant Reformation, the humanist culture sort of preserved a certain amount of cultural unity so that people were still in dialogue with each other. So anyway, I'll just stop there, but wondering if Miles had any thoughts, questions, or comments.
Well, I think there's sort of two steps here. So one is that there's for me at least, and perhaps for some of the people in the audience, a reasonably convincing repudiation or rebuttal against the critique that excesses seen in modernity need to be laid at the feet of the Renaissance itself, right? So that the humanist tradition is not in itself the cause of a kind of demoralized, materially centered existence, or a focus on the merely human without recourse or reference to the transcendent. So there's that kind of refutation. There's a question about whether it really was a break with the things that traditionalists champions. And for example, you made the point of continuity with the Middle Ages, the fact that a great deal of the work and fruits of the Renaissance is really a flowering of activity underway for centuries in the Renaissance. So once that's been established, the question is, are the traditionalist critics fully wrong? In other words, when they point to the sorts of things that Solzhenityen laments in decadent modernity, where societies begin to lose their fabric, where people are affluent but unhappy, et cetera, where do we lay the turn? And I think it's an open question because Solzhenitsyn himself seems to be of multiple minds. In the Harvard address that you're talking about, he begins by identifying a turn with some negative seeds in it in the Renaissance. But he actually says that in early democracies, as in American democracy at the time of its birth, individual human rights were granted on the ground that man is God's creature. That is, that freedom is given to the individual conditionally in the assumption of his constant religious responsibility. And this was the heritage of the preceding 1,000 years. So he seems to turn back towards a view that there is this continuity between, for example, the laying of foundations that the perennialists celebrate and the early works of modernity. And then he even goes so far as to say 200 or even 50 years ago, it would have seemed quite impossible in America that an individual be granted boundless freedom with no purpose simply for the satisfaction of his whims. So I guess the question on behalf of humanism is, can humanism in some ways temper this type of unmoored individualism and its ailments? And can it also offer something that perhaps reactionaries are missing?
Yes. So I mean, now what can be said to be true, right? I mean, it does seem the case that the Renaissance turned human attention from theology, which was the central focus of the Middle Ages, right? I mean, the intelligentsia in the Middle Ages were primarily friars and monks, right? To the human realm. I think that that is something we have to concede is true, which it doesn't necessarily mean secular in the modern sense, perhaps secular in the sense that we're talking about a lot more lay people who are involved in the world of business, right? And the world of business and politics and the life of the world. So what I would want to look at are some of the themes, and whether you consider them positive or negative, that's something you can evaluate for yourself. Some of the themes in the Renaissance which are developed in modernity, perhaps radicalized, and look at the ways in which there's also continuity between the Renaissance and the modern epoch, right? So what is not in continuity is the idea of breaking from the past and the idea of secularism in the anti-religious sense, right? I think that is clear. But there are nonetheless a number of themes that are different from the Middle Ages and starting to move toward modernity. So one of them is individualism, right? Burckhardt says that the pivotal thing about the Renaissance is the discovery of the individual, okay? So, Dawson says, right, he says as follows, he says that in the new Renaissance society, right, he was an individual, he's talking about man, right? He says that in the Middle Ages, he was a craftsman or a clerk or a monk or a soldier, and he was bound strictly to the order of the guild and the university and the religious order. But in the new Renaissance society, he was an individual who tried to assert the freedom of his personality and to realize every possibility of development. Now he says, now the medieval corporative idea was undoubtedly more Christian insofar as it was consciously inspired by the Pauline idea of an organic unity in which every function, even the most humble, has his part to play in the service of the whole, right? So he's thinking of St. Paul in Corinthians. He talks about how all Christians are members of one body and each has their function within the body of the whole. He says, but the Renaissance ideology also had a religious aspect since it was inspired by the Christian ideal of the dignity of human nature and the greatness of every individual soul, right? So Dawson's arguing that even the Renaissance individualism has basically still a Christian root. But as modernity goes forward, of course, individualism gets developed in many different ways, right? So you have the religious individualism during the Protestant Reformation, which saw no need for the mediation of the church and the authority of the church. And then you have the development of liberalism, which is, we could say, economic and political individualism. So this theme that's developed, that begins in the Renaissance, is then developed in many different spheres of modern culture, religious, economic, and political. Now, number two, I would say, would be optimism concerning human powers, right? So clearly, if you believe that the study of the classics can improve human beings intellectually and morally, you have a confidence in human powers and their capacity to be educated, right? And so this optimistic spirit is, I think, very much part of modernism, right? And it plays eventually into progressivism, right? So if you think about the anti-humanist or non-humanist strains in Christianity, right? Like, so for Augustine says, the will therefore is then truly free when it is not the slave of vices and sins, such was it given to us by God, and this being lost by its own fault can only be restored by him who was able at first to give it, right? So there is a strain in Christianity as well that says that human beings cannot by their own power free themselves from sin, right? That they require a supernatural intervention, right? This was not wholly denied in the Renaissance, but the accent was more on those elements of Christianity which accented human dignity, right? And like you saw in Aquinas, the idea of the competence of human powers, right? There's a reaction against this in the Reformation, right? So Calvin refers to human nature after the fall as a fearful deformity, right? So it was not uncontroversial, the Renaissance optimism. But that, I think, is another major theme, right? Renaissance optimism. Now, another would be positivity toward the world, right? So if we think of the Middle Ages, we could think of the ideal as being monastic, the renunciation of the world, right? The world as allurements to sin, right? To sins of greed for the world's goods, of sexuality, of the lust for power, right? And that the ideal life is one of renouncing this world for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Now, what does Christopher Dawson says about the Renaissance? He says, the human has learned from Xenophon and Plato and Isocrates that education was an art which should aim at the harmonious development of every side of human nature, physical, moral, and intellectual. Thus, they gained an awareness of the limitless possibilities of the enrichment of personal life by art and literature and social intercourse, right? So we have a more this worldly orientation, right? The Renaissance tended to valorize, for example, a public political life in the world or the world of commerce, right? And this probably reflects the growth of the laity, the growing importance of non-clerics in the culture, right? So it was not a repudiation of Christianity, but it was an interest in how to enrich this life in this world more, right? An interest in this world was vastly expanded, right? I mean, it's not a coincidence that the Renaissance and the age of exploration went kind of hand in hand in some sense. And this maybe leads to another issue, which is naturalism, the interest in nature. So we see this in art, right? I mean, people have said that when they look at Da Vinci's paintings, like the Virgin on the Rocks, I think it's called, geologists can identify the actual rocks that are there, right? I mean, there's this interest in observing the world, right, that you see in Renaissance art and just in generally, right? There's this new interest in nature. And Dawson makes the interesting point that in Da Vinci, we have this linking of art and science. Right? I mean, both are sort of interested in nature, and they both kind of come together, right? Art, science, and even mathematics, we could say. And so we could say the Renaissance is really a fuel for the scientific revolution. In medieval art, there was much less interest in, let's say, getting it right in terms of the natural order, and much more interest in the use of a symbolic language to represent spiritual things, right? So we do see that shift. So to summarize, I would say individualism, optimism concerning human powers, positivity toward the world, and naturalism are four themes, right, that were enormously fertile in modernity. Whether you think, certainly many of the directions that went in, traditionalists would think of as bad. But nonetheless, I think we have to say that the Renaissance helped to inspire those trends. But that doesn't mean that the particular way it went was determined from the point of the Renaissance, right? So that would be my summary of Renaissance contributions to the modern worldview.
Right.
Do you have any thoughts or questions there, Miles?
Well, I think it's an enormously useful tour through some of the themes, and I think, in some ways, it is easier to remain on the plane, or it's clearer at least to remain on the plane of the history of ideas and creeds. So we can say what belongs in a logical or moral way to a certain approach. I think part of what makes this both an interesting and a difficult area for discussion and debate is the fact that what's being fought over is also a history of conditions. So whether it generated them because of its ideas or core precepts or not, the Renaissance world saw the beginning of what we can identify as modernity in terms of a lot of physical and worldly conditions, right? The emergence of technology, the development of knowledge which can be codified and transmitted, so that the people who use knowledge in later generations can actually be stupider than the people who discovered it because of the way in which knowledge is coded. And of course, economic activity, which means the broadening of freedoms and prosperity in almost every aspect for a much wider base of the population. So much so that we see, in effect, the end of class or caste thinking and society. And that comes to fruition in the New World, which in some ways is both a challenge to the critique of the modernist project as it plays out in Europe, and also a particularly vexing case for a lot of traditionalists. I guess what I was going to propose is, it's not necessarily going to be convincing if we engage people who are coming at this problem from a traditionalist perspective to tell them that nothing has gone wrong. So on the one hand, I would expect most reasonable people to grant that what you call modernity, whether it began in the Renaissance or earlier or later, has seen with it the alleviation of poverty and all kinds of human misery, even at the same time as we have also seen the emergence of factionalism or sectional interests, what we now call identity politics, as well as a lot of the unhappiness that goes with what you might call anomie. So you've got material abundance in the midst of increasingly manifest spiritual want. So what can we say about the detachability of the material side of modernity from its ideas? I'm not proposing that we can resolve that question at all, and certainly not in this short podcast or this short YouTube video. But can we say something about whether or not all of this is jettisonable from the precepts of the Renaissance, whether or not they're responsible for both the plus side or the negative side of modernity?
Yeah, well, I mean, so first of all, I think one has to say that a lot of things happened between, basically the traditionalist problem is secular modernity, right? I mean, modernity gave rise to a secular form of civilization which fundamentally challenges religious tradition, right? And the religious worldview. And of course, they would see this as responsible for a lot of the dark side of modernity. If you think of totalitarianism and 2 world wars and genocides and all sorts of things, much of which was enabled by modern technology, right? So in terms of the dark side of modernity. Now, between the Renaissance and secular modernity, a lot of things happened, right? So I think one of the things that we have to discuss to account for that would be 150 years of religious wars in Europe, right? Which had the tendency, right? So the religious zeal of Europe at the time went into sort of fratricidal conflicts, right, of enormous violence, right? By some accounts, I believe close to a third of the German-speaking population was slaughtered in the 30 Years' War. Just enormous amounts of slaughter. And so the Enlightenment was in part, right, with its emphasis on tolerance and even the idea of separating religion and the state, which was an aspect of the New World that you had mentioned, right? Of non-establishment of religion and these sorts of things, all has that also as a context. So I think what you have is a radicalization of elements within the Renaissance in terms of the humanism and optimism and positivity toward the world, right? All that gets greatly augmented together with historical events which weakened the role of Christianity within the West. So in terms of accounting for that, the traditionalists, I don't think we can say that they are wrong, that secular modernity exists and represents a problem for anyone bonded to religious traditions, right? But the question of the day was, to what degree can that be laid at the feet of the Renaissance? And it seems to me difficult to argue that there was any sort of determinism that required that we go from Michelangelo and Marsilius Ficino to let's say the reign of terror or modern totalitarianism, right? All of that seems like a stretch. So does that do anything towards addressing it, or perhaps there are parts of your question I have not yet addressed?
No, that's a very good answer. I guess basically, you touched on probably the most galvanizing point, which is not just the anomie with which we started, but Solzhenitsyn came at his journey of reflection and discovery by witnessing the charnel house of modernity, right? A former communist who lived through the Gulag. He's not only talking about the kind of malaise that he might have been able to present to Harvard students some decades ago. He's talking about genocide under the auspices of modern ideology, which I think a lot of people would argue is in itself, by its nature, a perversion of theology. But is that sort of slaughterhouse of the 20th century counterable by Renaissance humanism in any way, as opposed to merely saying, we can defend the Renaissance and the humanist tradition from guilt of that is there anything that can be done? We can't go back in time and avoid it, but can we progress, as it were, back to something more wholesome in the form of a community and also an individual in his right relation to all things from God down to earth?
Yeah, well, so I think you hit upon the right point. Certainly, my first job, given that it's the Petrarch Institute, was exculpation and dealing with that issue. But yes, so Christopher Dawson said that one of the basic problem in accounting for the modern crisis, right, where we see the two world wars and the genocides and the well, probably minimally 70 million people slaughtered, right, in the first half of the 20th century alone. That what has happened really is the augmentation of technology, of technological power, but contrary to the dreams of Enlightenment thinkers like Condorcet, right, that didn't take with it any real augmentation in human wisdom or virtue, right? And so if we look at what the goals of the classics and classical education are, they're precisely not so much the development of the technical world, right, of the technological world, although one can point to connections between the classics and even that, but the development of man himself, right, in terms of moral and intellectual excellence. And unfortunately, there have been tendencies in the modern age to sort of neglect the wisdom of the past, right, that can be found in things like the classics, in terms of, one, understanding human nature, right? I mean, even just the study of the past teaches us a lot about human nature, which may be more constant than it is malleable, right? And therefore what we can expect and what we can not expect, but also the possibilities of improvement intellectually, morally, and otherwise, right? Bringing to fruition human powers and faculties through this form of education. Not saying exclusively, right? But that humanist focus was also something which I think in a certain point in modernity was lost as the idea grew, and this was a very anti-Renaissance idea, that we are wiser, that we are better and wiser and more intelligent and more advanced than these primitives of the past, right? This was the exact opposite of what the Renaissance was about. But once that idea grew, I think that a lot of that became lost. A lot of that thinking about wisdom and virtue got lost. So does that help at all?
I think it does, and I think it also addresses another one of the, this is a room full of elephants. That's what's tricky about it. And one of the elephants in the room that we don't have time to talk about today is what I think one Polish author called the demon in democracy. And I think there's a question emerging in modernity and rejoined mistrustfully by some of the perennialists, traditionalists, reactionaries, this idea of whether or not people can be trusted, right? Because as democracies emerge, they might be seen as, in some ways, a model inspired or driven by Renaissance ideals, but they also, as they empowered lots of people and freed them from personal or even intergenerational servitude, unleashed the ferment of crowd sentiment, intemperate mob preferences and convictions and things like that. And I think you've just spoken to something we can talk about in a later discussion in a separate episode, the way in which actually the Renaissance ideal points to a discipline which can be taken up freely by an individual of almost any station in life. And if he or she does so, it can yield great dividends at the personal, the familial, and the social plane. And so, just as there are, occasions of sin, the Renaissance thinkers, with their hard work and their excavation of the past, they helped discover and rediscover, occasions of virtue, so to speak. So I think your last remarks there are helpful on that topic, which, as I say, is yet another can of worms, or another big issue that touches on what we wanted to tackle today, but warrants discussion in its own right.
Indeed. Yes, but probably we should close out just because we tackled quite a few topics in a relatively short time. But I hope this was interesting for people. And again, if you find these topics and thoughts and discussions interesting, I would encourage you to look at the Petrarch Institute and its courses more closely. So take care, everybody.
And one more time, Alex, how do they reach you if they'd like to look into that?
My email is on this video at the bottom. So just email. Okay, everyone, take care.
See you next time.
Bye-bye.